monarchy, 200 years, culminating in the Hyksos invasion, that the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty, taking the war chariot from the invaders, carve out by conquest an empire and bureaucratic rule of more blatant material splendor than Egypt had known before. How different the sophisticated imperial smile from that instinctive and eternal smiling of the old kingdom. Thutmose's face is a stylized mask of display, though under its regal conformity lurk the strains of romantic flagrance. And now, for the first time, we have an almost slick art of marvelous technical facility applied to imperial theatrics, not the decorations of Brighton Pavilion for George IV, nor of the steamship Normandy, are more brilliant, while these tomb carvings have the advantage of being real. Yet their reality is as earthly thin as the surface of the relief. That life is a veil of appearance, harpers and dancing girls, nobles smelling lotus bloom. There is commerce and prosperity, the multiplication and refinement of pleasure. Under that surface mounts a hunger which produces in the bust of Nefertiti the most romantic of all depictions of woman, sensuous lips, raised chin, and wishful eyes, as if desire must always increase with the repletion on which it feeds. Finally, in the Amarna representations of her mystical pharaoh husband Iknaton, the sensory longing and disillusion which undergird the whole new kingdom, whiplash in a personal one-god revolution, Iknaton expressionistically distorted, a Pentecostal priest under the inspiring rays of Aton. He wrote, "I shall breathe the sweet breath which comes from thy mouth. I shall behold thy beauty every day. It is my desire that I may hear thy sweet voice even in the north wind, that my limbs may rejuvenate with life through love of thee. Give me thy hands holding thy spirit, that I may receive it and may live by it. Call thou upon my name through all eternity, and it shall never fail." Surely this was a point of departure for the Hebrews who had entered Egypt in the Hyksos period and would leave it under Moses a century and a half after Iknaton. A lesson in the uses of adversity, that perhaps the most crucial turn in religious history should spring from what could so easily be called the sickness and degeneracy of the revealed person of Iknaton. Iknaton's immolation of romantic ego to the mystical divine, for which he would have changed the worship of Egypt, sacrificing empire, self, and all, was suppressed after his death. As Jeffers says, protest, a bubble in the molten mass, pops and sighs out, and the mass hardens. His successors beat back to a more fatuous imperialism, trying to shore up a demoralized kingdom. Ramesses II's giant attempts to outdo the vaunts of Thutmoses III. As his Pentawera temple inscription runs, "Mine is the strength of 100,000. I fall upon them like a raging fire and lay waste their serried ranks. As a falcon among fowl I sweep down on them. I strike and do not weary of striking." From that conventional pomp, we take a 5-century slide through the hollowness and nostalgia of the Saitic kingdom to the reversion, "In my end is my beginning," of the beast god Bes. Beyond are hybrid refinements, out of Egypt, by Greece and Rome. The vital course was run, consumed with that which it was nourished by. Through its long history, Egypt was not isolated, and the pattern of the one many where we began would lead us to ask if Mesopotamian Ur and Sumer, from the time of the Old Kingdom and soon after, or even the first cities of the Indus, shared in that phase of keen discovery. Whether Neo-Sumeria and Babylonia Hammurabi's stele of laws paralleled the Middle Kingdom of duty and obligation. Was the bloodstream and nerve net of trade, as later in Europe, sufficient to actualize so interwoven a history? Here music, too, should offer a discovered analogue, but the chordal interpretation of the Hurrian cult song from an Ugaritic cuneiform is so hypothetical. Who can believe this tune the old cow died by is quite what Ezekiel would object to in the dark idolatries of alienated Judah? Certainly the cultural web proliferates as we advance toward the new kingdom. And suddenly from maritime Crete comes an art about 1500 BC, which seems to telescope what had gone before and to anticipate Egyptian luxury to follow. Its natural freedom and airy humanity suggest a Minoan age of joy. Yet that brief and sensuous smile attends the matured and sophisticated empires, ships bearing wine and oil and spices from Egypt and Asia Minor to Greece and Troy. Here is an island peak of the submerged continent from which the Homeric poems must in part derive. The excavations on Crete and at Mycenae spurred a cyclical rethinking of Homer, as in Kazantzakis' New Odyssey and in Yeats. A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Against the 3-in-1 of Egypt, the pre-Hellenic seemed divided like Greco-Rome into a Minoan phase of discovery and a weightier power phase involving a new conquering people centered in Mycenae. Here the invading Achaeans, absorbing Cretan skills into a zone of ruder force, built to Aegean hegemony, reducing the island of Crete itself to a tributary. The Lion Gate of Agamemnon's city rich in gold, carved 4 centuries before the Trojan War, sets a type of the successor power, against which the art of waning Knossos has the sophisticated elegance of the Hellenistic or recent European. Indeed, this precious lady has been called La Parisienne. Assume she also lived in Troy, since by the 12th century of the Trojan upheaval all over the Aegean such refinements must have been on the point of yielding to inner violence and barbarian vigor. Soon after the Trojan War, in that time of troubles when Egyptian scribes recorded, "The islands of the sea are restless," Achaean Mycenae fell before fresh Greek tribes from the north, culminating in the Dorians. So we reach the Dark Age birthplace of Homeric myth. As Yeats says in a vision, "I imagined the Annunciation that founded Greece as maid to Leda, and that from one of her eggs came love, and from the other war." I had not read Yeats when I went to Crete and Greece in 1939, but when I saw the 8th century Greek geometric, purpose renewed in the cleansing reversion to primitive force, after the almost cloying sweets of Knossos, thinking of our own time and of late Rome, I began unconsciously where Yeats had left off, with a poem affirming the geometric style. Penance is to pay for trespass only the path to pardon, and pardon's fullness not built but on hunger. Wherefore Rome fell, and Cretan softness. Mournful stood many, as when the whip strikes self-wielded. Well may the lash be longed for and lamented. What sage can affix our blessing of pain or gladness? Who gives his life finds it. Paradox, such is our wisdom, and ends with grasping, lifeless in conquest, as who runs and drops dead. Touch no string of sorrow, the sweet sound rots to the core. What is lost? Death. And ahead, penitence, pain, crudeness, desert earth, or worse, bare plots of stone, now known, our last defendants. By 600, this colossal hero at Olympia, The smiling keenness of the archaic leavens the monumental bareness. As Simonides says, pray to the gods, with the gods is power. What is individual and earthly is just nascent in what is common and divine, yet the more alive for that containment. Of this force, which in politics and thought was already remaking the inner and outer worlds, Hölderlin writes, so the gods of heaven come in, with such deep trembling down through the shadows their day-spring breaks among men. Denn so kehren die himmlischen ein, tief schütternd gelangte so, aus den Schatten herab, unter die Menschen ihr Tag. No sequence could illustrate as richly as the Greek the refinement out of the style of force of a lyrically sensuous art of joy. The driving sharpness slowly slacks the string, so pointed peaks wear to an alluvial plain. The blend of primitive ground and individual emergence gives 6th century Ionic chori a sapphic poignance of delight with which only the Western Gothic can be compared, though in another flight of spirit. But since the triumph, tragedy, and inner deepening of Greek culture, expressed in the resonances of thought, poetry, and the arts, requires at the least a separate study, we trim to the fewest cyclical hints. How vibrant, against the later consolidation of Rome, that exploratory wave which sent Greek colonies over the Mediterranean, raising temples on the headlands of Sicily, Africa, Italy, France, and Spain. Thus we reach the acme, the mid-5th century of Pericles. In the perfection of the representational and humanistic, every personal emotion and feature is still born on the cresting of common faith and inherited laws. Like the great tragedies, especially of Aeschylus, this pan-Hellenic and Olympian art is a reasoned vindication of the gods. There is almost no parallel for the swiftness of Greek fruition. What reared free city-states led them to the value-rending Peloponnesian War. The first shoots of philosophy flowered in a sophistic questioning of everything. Speculative tragedy, which celebrated the gods in Aeschylus, in Euripides' doubts and complains. Here the chromatic fragment which survives from his Orestes. From the 5th century BC to the 4th, is from the strength of the Periclean Zeus Poseidon to the softness of this Praxitelean Hermes. From the paean of the civic man-god, as Sophocles wrote in the Antigone, many a wonder lives and breathes, but the wonder of all is man. Polla tadeina kuden anthropou denoteron pelei. To the relativizing mellowness of an art so sensuously ideal that the strength of stone seems to dissolve in a dreaming mist. What Arnold called the dialogue of mind with itself has begun. Against the 5th century of tragic drama, the 4th seems a century of thought. In Plato, the subjective search, a civic weakness, is also the first fruit of a meditative detachment of soul, which would open catacombs of inwardness under outward Greece and Rome. The Barberini faun, mid-3rd century, drunk and lectured out, shows one drift of Hellenistic art, the conspicuous, even ugly, exploitation of sensate variety. It is the sort of license moralists would later deplore when it came flooding from Greece into the sink of imperial Rome. But if we ask, what is that spraddled faun dreaming of? It might, as in Mallarmé, say nymphes, je veux les perpétuer, reveal a complementary aspect of the Hellenistic, a sensuous feminine form of romantic, almost spiritual idealization. Between the titillation of appetite and the increasingly soulful search beyond, the late Greek is strung. Does this art of conscious extravagance and nostalgia correspond to the first Egyptian decay at the end of the Old Kingdom under Pepi, or to the more phtisic novelties of the New Kingdom? It is the genius of cyclical history not to resolve questions so precisely phrased.